Hello guys, Luis from Ketogains here. Today we're going to interview Dave Feldman from the blog The Cholesterol Code. And Dave is going to do an incredible presentation on all things cholesterol and an awesome study that he's been doing on himself. And a great experiment for almost, what, a year, Dave?
Yeah, it's been about 12 months. In fact, I'm coming up on the anniversary in a few days.
Incredible. So Dave, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you are doing, who you are?
Sure. Actually, in about April of 2015, last year, is when I started a ketogenic diet. And I did so because I'd gotten an A1C marker back of 6.1, which is consistent with somebody who has prediabetes. Well, on my dad's side of the family, genetically, unfortunately, a lot of my family on his side of the family is type 2 diabetic. And so I actively sought to avoid that. So I learned everything that I could about a ketogenic diet, started it, and then about 7.5 months later, which was almost exactly a year ago, was when I got back my first cholesterol test. And in doing so, I found out that it exploded. It had gone from what was considered to be a more normal range to a much higher range. And from there, I started learning everything I could about cholesterol in particular and the lipid system as a whole. And that's kind of what started this whole journey, and why I started cholesterolcode.com was because in the course of doing that, I recognized as a software engineer that experience, particularly in systems and especially in networks, led to my recognizing the pattern that I feel like I see in the lipid system, and that I still stand by 12 months later, appears to show that it's actually much more active and agile than all the literature I read identifies. I kind of created a briefed up version of the slides that I had for that, so this is going to be a bit overly brief, but I'll probably just go ahead and switch over to that, catch us up on that end, and then I'll kind of catch you up to the data to date.
Okay, so before you start, why don't you explain to us and the audience what normal, normal doctors and everybody on the planet think about cholesterol, and why do we think that cholesterol by itself is a bad thing?
Sure. It's certainly a lot of people are watching this now. If they're familiar with the 1, 2, 3 of the early stages of the ketogenic diet, and when it gets talked about, there's Ansel Keys and the last, I want to say 60 years of medicine that has had what is considered to be the diet heart hypothesis. The diet heart hypothesis is that with higher levels, it originally was with higher levels of cholesterol that you ingest, you'll end up with higher levels of cholesterol in your bloodstream. Those higher levels of cholesterol in your bloodstream lead to atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in the arteries. Now, over time, this has been kind of, I jokingly say rebranded, but basically it changed from, okay, maybe it's not just ingested cholesterol, but particularly saturated fat. And it's not actually total cholesterol. It turns out that there's a stratification between HDL cholesterol, high density lipoproteins, the good cholesterol, and the bad cholesterol that we knew was kind of the problem in the first place. They would say the low density lipoproteins. More recently, they say, okay, actually, we concede that low density lipoprotein cholesterol is not really the problem. It's actually the particles themselves, and the quantity of the total particles, that's atherogenic. The thing that I really want to emphasize right here for everybody, and it's super important, is that as of yet, the pathogenesis to atherosclerosis, as in the origin of it starting as a disease and progressing, that origin point has still not actually been observed empirically, not yet. So there's a lot of assumptions, and we want to believe that those assumptions are based on a lot of reasonable scientific foundation. But I'm here to tell you that there's actually a number of problems with it, including a theory most people don't hear about that's a counter theory to that, that's got a whole lot more merit. So to do that, I've kind of got to get into a slide that I've got a little bit further down where I sort of explain the LDL particles themselves. Actually, there's one other thing I sort of want to put in real quick, and they can follow me on Twitter at Dave Keto, D-A-V-E-K-E-T-O. And of course, there's Facebook. I obviously hang out at the Ketogains Facebook group from time to time. You guys always post a lot of great content there. Everybody who is on a low carb, high fat diet needs to know that they get the majority of their cellular energy from triglycerides. These are triglycerides that are coming in the form of food. And there's a whole process that takes them apart, puts them back together, that I'm not going to get into too deep a detail. But I'll just say that it's ultimately low density lipoproteins that bring those triglycerides to their cells, typically in the form of long chain fatty acids. And in the process of doing so, that's how your cells are mostly getting their energy. Now, we hear a lot about ketones, and for sure, as you get into a ketogenic diet, you are producing much more ketones, and you do derive a larger portion of energy from ketones than somebody who's carb-centric. But a lot of those ketones, proportionality speaking, are partitioned a lot to the brain because they can cross the blood-brain barrier. The actual majority of your energy is still coming from the triglycerides coming in those low-density lipoproteins. Why is this important? This is important because those same containers that contain the triglycerides, the LDL particles, also contain the cholesterol that is vilified. They say that cholesterol that's in those low-density lipoproteins, that cholesterol is what's creating atherosclerosis, and it's going to put you in the grave sooner. So, make no mistake, whatever your cholesterol score comes back at, I believe it's a concentration preference on the part of your body. And the concentration itself doesn't detract from the fact that you are trafficking more LDL particles, whether you have a high or a low score. You still have to traffic more of them. It's just a physical fact. Due to the reality that you are bringing in more triglycerides, you have to process them for your cellular energy. That's just the bottom line. And everybody who is on a low carb diet should know that if you truly believe that it's sheer exposure to LDL particles that's going to create atherosclerosis for you, then you should go on a vegan diet. And you should be much more comfortable with hyperinsulinemia. Because the bottom line is you will be moving more of those triglycerides through your body as you necessarily should.
Exactly. So let me put it in a laid back version, an even more abridged version than what you just explained. For those who may not really want to get into details, is as you said before, normally, and also this is very important for other countries as well, because they may not be as advanced as the current research that there is in the United States, especially here in Mexico. There's still a lot of people and lots of doctors that stayed on the first part of what you just explained, which is people either think that total cholesterol is a culprit. We now know that, or the theory has advanced, that it's not only total cholesterol, but also that there are various types of cholesterol. The most known are LDL and HDL. And then it also does not matter if it's, the HDL, which is normally considered as the good cholesterol, and the LDL, which is normally considered as the bad cholesterol. Each one has a purpose, just like you explained right now. So really, yes, it really does not matter actually how high or how low it is, but more so if you have other accompanying symptoms and as well the context of your diet. As you said, if you're eating a higher fat diet and also without carbohydrates, then really there's nothing to worry about, especially at the start of the diet. Right?
Yes, actually, and I'm going to go a step further. A lot of the research that I have up to this point has me questioning just about everything.
Yeah, I agree.
So first of all, this is another thing that I wish everybody knew about lipoproteins, particularly low-density lipoproteins. Their primary purpose is to deliver energy. That's their primary purpose. They have a secondary purpose and really, you can almost say it's a tie between two. Between reparative, cellular repair, because cholesterol and phospholipids are needed by the cells.
Of course.
Something called receptor mediated endocytosis, which is just another way of saying the cells will actually engulf the LDL particle and pull it apart and make use of all the different elements within it. But it also has an immunological response. It actually has a means by which it can clear different particles, problematic particles from the bloodstream. It binds to almost anything. And that includes reactive oxygen species, otherwise known as free radicals. Now, they'll say that's a bug. I'm not so sure. I think it's probably
the future.
yes. Like, because here's the problem. I don't think people really respect just how bad free radicals really are. They are like, I like to describe them as the antimatter of the bloodstream. They're a particle that has an unpaired electron that can bounce around and actually turn just about anything else into a free radical by stealing its electron through destruction with its bonds. And in doing so, they can destroy even things like DNA, right? And in the course of, from an engineering standpoint, we would call that a high severity bug. That's something that needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. And you can't just count on, say, your kidneys to filter every possible problem that comes down to a microscopic level like that. Something like that's got to be dealt with wherever it exists in the body, right? And this is why, from my perspective, lipoproteins, the more that I learned about it, the more I feel like they are genius. They're one of the body's most amazing pieces of work, because every single thing that is hydrophobic, as in it doesn't mix well with the blood, the body puts into a low density lipoprotein. So every kind of fat, including, fat soluble vitamins, it will package in and then say, okay, you can be used in multiple ways by the cells as is needed through the use of, and I'm not going to get into the deeper details of it, but apolipoproteins. Apolipoproteins and LDL receptors actually have a huge family of variations and uses in order to activate through enzymes those things that it wants from those lipoproteins. They're almost like the Amazon store for anything that's needed by the cells, right? And one of my frustrations is that I find oftentimes people I really revere, like Thomas Dayspring and Peter Attia, they'll state plainly that there's really no good purpose for the cholesterol to exist in those lipoproteins, since most of your cells can actually synthesize their own cholesterol. Well, you have a water faucet in your house, which could probably put out a lot of the fires you may accidentally set off in the kitchen, but not every kind of fire, right?
Yeah.
In which case, you kind of hope that a fire engine would come by if half of your house was on fire. You could put on your faucet to take care of that. Yeah. Likewise, you may have one of the most amazing garage sorry, rewind that. Likewise, you may actually have one of the best workshops in your garage and can probably fix and repair just about anything, unless your house gets hit by a truck. In which case, you're going to want to go to the Home Depot. But if you're a cell, you can't go to the Home Depot. You can't leave. You have to repair where you're at. So you need those supplies to be coming by you in the first place. And that's why it makes sense to me as to why endothelial cells, which are right there at the edge in your vessel wall, why endothelial cells express LDL receptors when they're damaged. They call for help from LDL particles. I don't think that's any mistake. I think that's because they're part of the reparative process. That's why they're part of the first responders.
Yeah, that brings us to the thing we were talking the other day about the ambulance email. I don't know if
okay, so
explain that, because it's awesome.
I have a great analogy for this that I now like to use a lot, which is, if you look it up statistically, you have about a 1 in 9 chance of dying in an ambulance. That's horrible. If you have a 1 in 9 chance of dying in anything, you should just avoid that thing, right? It's pretty obvious. So we could go a step further, and to prevent ambulance-based deaths, ban all ambulances. But obviously you see where the logical disconnect is here. The disconnect is that actually, no, the reason people are dying in ambulances is because they probably were hurt, injured, or sick in the first place, and they were being carried in the ambulance to the hospital. And unfortunately, that's where they ended up dying. Well, okay. Let's say, though, you're an alien race that just plopped down and you just had a snapshot of everything that was going on in the world. You would see that there was a tight association between a number of people that were sick and dying and being in these little red vehicles. And so you could assume from that, actually, there seems to be a problem and that these things are death traps. So really, we should try to get rid of them all, right? And that's my problem with how much LDL, cholesterol in particular, has been vilified, is because they vilify the entire LDL particle itself, assuming it is the problem. Now, let me carry that analogy just a little bit further. Let's just say for a second that I told you there are actually microscopic organisms that are in ambulances due to the fact that so many people who are sick and dying end up in them. And because of that, I do think that there is some merit to the likelihood being higher that you're going to die in an ambulance. The problem is, in order for you to do a study to determine that, you actually have to have people not ride in ambulances as an experiment intervention group, right? And you're probably going to have a tough time doing that, which is the same with people who, for example, have familial hypercholesterolemia. They're not going to choose to not have any lowering cholesterol therapy because they feel like at a minimum they need to have one or the other. And that's another problem with all of the studies right now. All the studies intermingle a number of prior therapies before starting the trial that they're on now. So let's say, for example, that I came to you and I said, actually, the microorganisms in an ambulance are really increasing the risk of death in an ambulance. Therefore, even though there's the association that you're going to make anyway, there actually is a problem that does exist in ambulances. And that might be something that might intuitively make sense to you. You might think, okay, actually, that does kind of make sense. How can I know for sure? And I could say, well, you can't, because unfortunately, it's not conducive to it's not something that we can observe. That's really the logic that currently exists behind the existing diet heart hypothesis, is even though it cannot yet be observed, it's an assumption that's been made from a while back. And even if there's a weak association, that's good enough for them to go ahead and prescribe cholesterol-lowering drugs. This is a bit of an overly briefed up version of my presentation that I'm going to kind of go through real quick. This presentation was, as you know, because you were there, was done on October 9th. And this was one of the very first slides I did. I said, I'm going to enjoy this because I get to start this off with a bang. I've wrapped my most recent experiment around this presentation because it's the first public presentation of my data. And there is a massive shift in my LDL cholesterol taking place right now. And so I had this slide, which was literally taken 2 days before my presentation. I put it in here. And then there's this slide, which is obviously a modification of this slide, but hadn't yet taken place yet, which is October 10th, 2016, right? And then I went ahead and did the following slides. So as you know, I'm a pretty hardcore N of oneer. I actually take pictures of virtually all of my data. And I take pictures of every single thing that I eat, everything.
If everybody is wondering about the definition of OCD, and you haven't made Dave Feldman, I thought I was one of the most anal persons in regarding to tracking food and everything that goes in my mouth. But when I met Dave at the Ketogains seminar in Las Vegas, I was astonished. This guy actually carries a small weight, and he actually measures a scale. He measures everything that goes into his system, as well as taking pictures. He has developed a system where he places his hand. Yeah, exactly. So he can actually, in case that he needs to be more accurate, he can remember or review the portions of everything he ate before, right?
Correct. When I don't have the scale, I almost certainly always have my hand in the picture because it creates a reference of volume. And granted, there's still potential for things to be shifted or changed. But for the most part, I find it gives me as close to the level of accuracy as I can want.
And this is also very interesting because we were just talking about it way before we started the interview. Normally, you can't expect, even if you eat the same things every day, to be the macros and calories be exactly the same. This is something quite important. There's a huge variability, especially when or even when eating whole foods, because, for example, you are seeing here a lobster. not two lobsters are alike. They
Right.
even they weighted the same. They are different beings, and their composition is going to be different. So Dave was explaining that even himself, as an engineer, that he tracks every single thing that goes into his system. He has estimated it to have about a 15-20% error margin.
Yes. Well, and per what I was telling you about before, there's a kind of funny way in which if I'm making mistakes, as long as I'm consistent about the magnitude of the mistake,
Mm-hmm.
then in making relative comparisons with my blood work, as long as I'm making mistakes with the bias in, like say for example, I'm judging 5 ounces of cheese as more like 7 ounces of cheese, right? And I seem to be adding about that level of margin from misjudging the total amount of cheese. As long as I'm consistent in that, then I'll actually end up with a closer level of accuracy relatively, as long as I can make that judgment. And that's where having my hand as volume is valuable.
Yeah.
Because I'm always making that judgment against my hand, even if I'm going back through the pictures and logging food.
Sure.
I have actually one other thing I'm just going to insert real quick. This food logging at the time that I was doing the presentation, I didn't actually have this done, but for your viewers who actually want to see how I do this, I actually wrote this up in cholesterol code. I just call it food logging protocol, and basically in it I show not only how I'm doing things and the order in which I prefer them, like capturing it on a scale with a digital readout visible is the best way, obviously.
Of course.
If you're capturing something total inside of a package or container, that's the second best way because you can at least get that.
Exactly. The content and the actual weight of the food eaten.
Yes. And then secondarily, same thing. If you can get your hand in the picture, that's great. But I even have some hand language that I developed over time. So for example, I started drinking this water and then realized, oh crap, I didn't take the picture. How do I denote that I had actually a full glass? Well, I put the pointer where it's supposed to be. But conversely, if I know I'm going to drink half of this, but I need to take the picture now, I'll point to the divide line. So it's what I call the fraction point. Same thing with the I'm done, which is this is how much salad I started with, which also includes the container. But now I'm done, in which case I do a palm down and 4 fingers in the shot to say this is where I'm stopping. So all I have to do is subtract 141 from 107, and that's the total amount that I ate. Same thing here. I do another I'm done because these cheeseburgers were gross. And then I have this last one, which is this usually happens at night. I'll start drinking a full bottle, and then I fall asleep. And in this case, I had still a fifth left. And so in the following morning, I have an upward point, which means I'm finishing up. And therefore, I can take this last one and say, okay, 4/5 of a bottle and 1/5 of a bottle of water on the morning after. I realize most of your readers, listeners would probably not go as far as I do in actually tracking water usage, but you'd be surprised how valuable it is, especially if you have a workout regime. Then it becomes actually pretty valuable.
Yeah, it is.
To track that. I'm even trying to get better about tracking salt. Tracking salt is actually very challenging.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, the point of all this is not to encourage everybody to actually track so annually like you do, but more so to explain that even if you tracked, there's a huge variability between what you actually eat and the result that you're gonna get. But it's quite important to track nonetheless, especially if you really want to get results in body weight. We have lots of people on different groups that are not seeing the results they want just by doing a ketogenic diet. And let's not forget that energy balance is always important. It's not as important as some people make it out to be. It's not the only pillar. Of course, there are hormones and everything else that we will probably see more in detail as you explain further along. But energy balance is still key. So you can gain weight on a ketogenic diet. You can gain weight while doing intermittent fasting if you ingest more calories that you require. How many, we don't exactly know because everybody is a bit different. But if you don't have a baseline to compare to and see, for example, if I eat 3 hamburgers, I maintain my weight. If I eat 2, I lose weight. And if I eat 4, I will probably gain. If you don't know that, particularly to you and your context, there's no way to know what you can tweak or you can change.
Yes, and let me absolutely stand apart from most people in the ketogenic community and say calories absolutely do matter. They are an energy load. They're literally energy, and the amount that you're ingesting will make a difference to your body. I commonly say you feed your body and then your body feeds your cells. We kind of talked about that a little bit more before. You may have priorities that you feel your body should take into account, but your body doesn't care that much about your priorities. It has a whole evolutionary timeline that it works with, and it has a lot of reason to think, oh, as much as you may want this 6-pack, we don't know for sure that you're not going to suddenly be starving when the next apocalypse hits. So we want to be sure that we actually put on a lot of adipose tissue. You can't just say to your body, I want this much that goes to muscle. I want only this much that goes to fat. I want this much to feed my brain, etc. Doesn't matter. It's going to determine on its own. Now, when we're counting carbs, it's math. When you're counting carbs, those are calories. It's 4 calories, right? And and same thing with fat. You're getting these are energy metrics. And so these calories do in fact count long term. And I'm going to get into the experiment again. This experiment that I wrapped around the Ketogains seminar, I did lose weight when my calories were low. I did gain weight when my calories were high. And I wasn't surprised by that. Now, all of that said, I'm pretty sure that I averaged around 2,300 calories to 2,400 calories when I was on a carbohydrate-centric diet. And I now have to have around 3,200 to 3,300 calories per day on my low-carb diet in order to maintain my weight. In order for me to gain weight, I have to eat more than that. But that's the new level that I'm at. So while I'm saying calories matter, I'm not discounting the fact that there is a hormonal factor that's a bigger deal, relatively speaking, but it doesn't discount the other. They're both in combination.
Exactly. And I'm going to place another, let's say, a range here, because you just said that you are eating way more calories than you used to eat before when you were on a normal diet, let's say, or a high carb diet.
Yes.
But what we have seen both in Ketogains, in my case, and also some athletes that are working with Peter Defty, and also with Alessandro Ferretti, is that once you've been doing low carb for a long while, and especially if you are an athlete, your body becomes more efficient in using those calories. For example, my case, my predicted BMR, my basal metabolic rate, is around 2,500 calories or so. I actually have to eat about 1,700 up to 2,000, and with that amount, I maintain perfectly. I don't lose weight, I don't gain weight. If I want to actually lose body fat, I have to go way lower. And most people would say I'm crazy and I would die, or I would not be able even to train or whatever, but I can train perfectly, and I'm not using any steroids or whatever. I can work out perfectly with 1,400 or so calories, and I can do squats and do my whole training that is quite intense with no losses of performance. So the theory goes that I'm using more efficiently the ATP that my ingested dietary fat generates. Basically, that's it. It's more so like my machinery is well oiled and well maintained, and I'm not wasting any calories. If you were to put it that way.
Yes. Well, and I believe there really are larger mechanisms at play that we can't even know yet, including corrections from dysregulation. Again, I'm a software engineer, so I keep looking at it as a larger system. Think about it from this perspective. I live in Las Vegas. In Las Vegas, I don't worry that much about traffic because traffic is actually surprisingly good here, except for on the Strip. On the Strip, it's well known to all of the drivers, especially the locals, that it's bumper to bumper. That's where all the action's at, right? All of the traffic outside of the strip is generally pretty good. That changed recently when they added some new reworkings on the road of one of the mainline roads, one of our main corridors, and that ended up creating more backup. Well, from my perspective, this is a lot of what hyperinsulinemia does, is it introduces mechanisms that have to be worked out within the body. And insulin is in itself almost a kind of urgency signal. It says we have to do something with this glucose that's in the bloodstream. Either carry it over to usage within stored as glucose, for example, or let's go ahead and do de novo lipogenesis and go ahead and do some lipogenesis and actually get it into the fat storage, right?
Yeah.
These processes are themselves at different levels of taxation in the body, right? But they definitely require attention within the body. One of the things that a lot of people don't fully grasp about being fat adapted is the ultimate end product most of the time are low density lipoproteins. That actually, if you flood your body with carbs, it can only use so much of it. What does it do with the rest of it?
Yeah, see, they're stored as glycogen. Yeah, it's stored as fat, basically.
Yeah, and in order to come up with the fat, it has to convert those through de novo lipogenesis. In the process of doing it, because it can't just stash the glucose. It can't stash the glucose directly into adipose tissue. It has to convert them to triglycerides, and it has to mobilize those triglycerides. So it has a process, and I can't speak yet because I don't know exactly what level of energy input and output there is. But for certain, there is a regulatory shift that has to go on in order for that storage to take place. And particularly when you're overloading it with a lot of energy all at once. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that in the course of eating a lot of food that is high in fat, the satiating principle also kind of spreads out the amount of introduction within the body. So from a system standpoint, it makes a whole lot of sense that it would be parsed out and less taxing for the larger regulatory burden. So you see where I'm going here, is it's not just about whether or not fat burns cleaner, which is also true. It's also about what level of proportionality and degree of pacing is involved in maintaining energy that comes from fat. And I would argue that because it ends up as the typical final end product for both feeding your cells and for storing into your adipose tissue, it's actually very low on the total regulatory burden. Might have gotten a little geeky there, but I think you gather what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's how I see it is more so once you are fine-tuned and let's say fat adapted, it's more like a clean energy. You get it in and you use it. There's like no noise in between. Like when you are on a high carb diet, you have to burn first the carbs and then you first you burn the fatty acids or the adipose tissue, right?
Right.
So then what we have seen, or my theory is that when you change from a high carb diet to a high fat diet, there's a period of inefficiency where your body has to get in tune to this new process, right? So this is why some people, like in your case, and especially if you're overeating, basically, you get a little bit more waste of energy. You will not get as fat as easy as, like you said, on a high carb diet. But eventually, and as long as you keep your, balanced diet, I mean, in regards to how many calories you need and you are ingesting, you will find that you probably, for one, are not so hungry, and then you actually don't need that many calories.
Yes. Well, and again, I would argue that it's from an ancestral health standpoint, it's because we've just had a lot of practice with it. We've had a lot of practice with protein and fat, lots and lots of practice. And in the course of doing it, our digestive systems are much more attuned to slowing us down. And as easily have a massive energy overload.
And that's an evolutionary standpoint. It actually makes sense to eat actually less and be able to do more, right?
Yes, of course. And again, from a system standpoint, the usage of fat definitely indicates that.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'll swing us back over to the presentation, as the very next thing I was going to go into was the blood tests, which, as you know, with every single blood test, I'm getting an advanced cholesterol test known as a NMR lipoprofile, and it breaks out the different particle counts. And to date, I've had 40 of these, which actually include other blood tests, which I'll talk about at a later time. 40 blood tests in 12 months, and I'd like to say it's been a lot of fun, but it hasn't. I actually really dislike needles, but as I like to joke, I like science just a little bit more than I hate needles. So this is what I found, and I kind of detail this on my blog. Basically, the dietary fat inversion for LDL-C is that for a 3-day average of dietary fat before the day of the blood test, this is what seems to have the greatest impact on what my resulting number will be for LDL-C the morning of the blood test. We have a high inverse correlation, and I'll get to that in the graphs in just a moment. That's for LDL-C, the cholesterol contained in those low-density lipoprotein particles. Okay, these are for the particles themselves, the dietary fat inversion for LDL-P. There seems to be a 3-day average of dietary fat, just like in the previous one, but with a 2-day gap. So, for example, this is, instead of 1 day before, this is 3 days before the blood test, 4 days before the blood test, and 5 days before the blood test. Probably more of your advanced listeners will care more about this if they're getting a particle test, but it took a little bit of parsing out to find out that that's what that score is. And it too has about an 80% correlation. It's really fascinating how the particles go on a slightly different timeline from the actual cholesterol contained inside them, as in the particle count, rather. So this is kind of what we talked about before, but it's worth reviewing. This is a low-density lipoprotein. As I joke, it's the Uber for your triglycerides. The triglycerides, as you can see, are most of the content in this, the T's. The C's are the cholesterol. Mostly, these triglycerides are getting saturated throughout your circulatory system to feed your cells. Cholesterol isn't necessarily ever used. It very well could stay. It's an analogy that I like is it's like the life rafts on boats. Life rafts are a good idea to have on boats. But if all you did was count life rafts, then when a bunch of boats entered your view, you'd say, oh, there's a big problem. There's a lot of life rafts in play. You shouldn't care about that. You should care about whether the life rafts are in the water. That's an indicator of an actual problem, is if they're in use. But boats' purpose are not to move around life rafts. The purpose of boats are to move around people and cargo. Okay, so there are 2 LDL particle types, and basically I'm just revealing this as 2 starting points, if you will. The chylomicrons, those start in the gut. They're synthesized through your small intestine, and they are known for having an ApoB48. That's the protein, the snaky apolipoprotein that wraps around it. And I'll just occasionally just refer to them as the stomach LDL, just to make it simple for layman terms. VLDLs, the very low density lipoprotein, that's synthesized in the liver, or recirculated by the liver would probably be a better way of putting it, just because you actually can have energy that comes ultimately to the liver and then it gets repackaged and put back out again. They have the ApoB100, but these are typically from storage. Your storage ends up making a difference. That's where we're going to get to in a second. The life cycle, this is the key. This is the key to, sorry, things getting a mind of its own. The lipoprotein life cycle, that is the key to the test that I have and why it is that I believe that there's such a tight homeostasis. The chylomicrons I just mentioned, the ones created in the gut, they expire in just a few hours. Whereas the VLDLs, the liver LDL, which comes from storage, they expire in a few days. So my fun, cartoony way of putting this is, here's your gut. Here's day 1, day 2, day 3. This is what your liver is watching for. And in this case, oh, from the gut is coming a whole bunch of chylomicrons. Lots and lots of incoming energy from the GI tract. I guess I'll downregulate. Therefore, it only synthesizes or recirculates a few VLDLs. That's in the state of food abundance or energy abundance. But in scarcity, oh, very little incoming energy from the GI tract. I guess I'll upregulate. So a few of these come out. It then goes ahead and builds up a whole bunch more. Therefore, the more I'm eating, the lower my cholesterol score. The less I'm eating, the more my cholesterol score. Okay.
Okay.
From that, I'm going to go ahead and swing over here to prove it.
So before you show the data, what would be the normal medical consensus of having people eat a high cholesterol diet? The normal theory would say that if you ate a lot of high cholesterol foods, your cholesterol would go up, right? That's
correct.
That's what everybody would think, and then would go and freak out about eating 6 whole eggs in a day, or eating salmon, avocado, lots of beef, or whatever, which is the normal ketogenic diet.
As we speak, there is not one piece of advice anywhere except on my blog, or really the data that I show for it, that says, actually, if all you care about is your cholesterol test score, then you should gorge on fat. In fact, gorge on saturated fat. Half of the fat that I eat is saturated fat. And for the experiment that I did that I wrapped around the Ketogains seminar, I was eating a preposterous amount of fat, which we'll get into in just like 1 second. But yes, you're correct. The advice is that if you go on a low carb diet, and like me, you end up being a hyperresponder, and your cholesterol baseline climbs up, the baseline being the floor, if you will, then the amount that you have can ultimately come down by, say, upping your monounsaturated fat versus your saturated fat. There's other things such as fiber. There's lots of different advice that's out there. But my data has the absolute tightest causal appearing link between, well, I can practically claim causal at this point because I proved it with the presentation itself. I actually made my cholesterol move, announced it, and staked my reputation on it. And for what it's worth, I could do it again. I'd have no problem doing that. So yes, keep that in mind because that should inform the context of the next thing I'm about to show you. So this is a little bit rough, but I'm literally showing you my spreadsheet as it stands right now. And I realize this is a little bit noisy, but disregard the colors for a sec because this is the point at which the Ketogains seminar started. What is in blue is the actual LDL-C test result. What is in the dashed orange is the 3-day average of dietary fat. As you can see, it kind of mirrors one after the other. Whereas a good way of seeing how well it correlates, which is that I'm going to flip this axis in the next chart. That's what it looks like. So again, disregarding this part over here for a second, you can see that everything up to the Ketogains seminar had a very tight correlation, about a negative 0.8, which is jaw-droppingly tight.
Exactly.
And it's inverted. I can't emphasize enough that this is clearly a highly regulatory process for it to be offsetting against something else that's incoming. It'd be one thing for it to track with it, but it's actually exactly the opposite of what conventional medicine thinks that it is. And I'm astonished that the human body can be that accurate.
Yeah, it's incredible. It sounds actually almost looks made up.
It does. And that's why, like, I'm still, even as I report it, I'm still stunned by just how tight it is. It's incredible. So right around here is where I knew I'd be going into the Ketogains conference, and that's where I decided to go ahead and really step on the gas. Now I'm going to cut out about half of this graph and go ahead and bring you to this new graph. And that's really this last graph, but with the other data points, half the data points cut out. So you can kind of see the lead into it. But now I'm going to explain what these colors mean. So the 3-day average of dietary fat, you see here, it's still the dashed line. But these brown lines were just before and just after the conference. this is never before seen data, at least as of the point of this recording. I showed everybody this drop, but I haven't actually had a chance to report that there was a blood test before and a blood test after. And you can see how much, when doing a radical shift down in total dietary fat, because low is high, high is low here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm averaging here about 63 grams of fat. And it does, in fact, pull up my cholesterol number, the LDL-C, upward. But I went so fast that it couldn't hold to the correlation. Likewise, I was averaging 63 grams of fat and then shifted super fast into 461 grams of fat a day. And that, by the way, ended up being about a 5,000 calorie diet for about 3 days. It's really ridiculous. I really was never so sick of food in my life. But I knew it would pull down the cholesterol, which it did. It pulled it from 256 to 183. And then 5 days later, to my surprise, even for as hard as I shifted it downward, it ended up actually catching back up to it. So it ended up at 155, which was the lowest score in cholesterol that I've had to date while being on a ketogenic diet.
So for people who are watching this, the importance is Dave went first, he lowered his dietary fat intake to around 63 grams of dietary fat, and actually his cholesterol increased. Then he increased again his dietary fat up to around 400 grams a day, and the cholesterol dropped.
Correct. And here's kind of my infographic that sort of explains the same thing, but just in the straight numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the slide we just showed. Here's the timeline. So I averaged 748 calories a day, 63 grams of fat, saturated 24 grams of fat, very low saturated fat. Yet my cholesterol numbers climbed like crazy. Then starting Friday morning's blood test on October 7th, 8th, and 9th, which wrapped around the presentation, I ate 5,048 calories, 461 grams of that being fat, 274 grams being saturated fat.
A small parenthesis here. Yeah, so around how much protein were you ingesting during the stage of this experiment?
So let me pop over to here. From the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th, I was having protein of around 199 rounded up. So lots and lots of protein. However, because I tried to maintain proportionality, it should also be noted that I necessarily had a lot more carbs, net carbs, relative to what I usually eat. So the average ended up being around 33 of net carbs. Gross carbs, even higher, of course, 72. I usually count net carbs, but different people are different on that. That said, that may end up being relevant for the next thing, because I believe what you're probably going to ask me next is, how would that have affected my ketones, right?
Exactly.
So I have over here in my notes what did happen with my, and these were all from the Precision Extra. Coming up to the tail end of my low caloric load, my BHB was rising to, I ended up with the highest score that I'd ever had on the very last day. And this was again over here, this is maintaining extremely low caloric load of around 750-ish. And my net carbs were a lot lower, and my total fat much, much lower. I didn't want to go crazy low with protein, of course, because I wanted to be sure that I had enough. But that said, sure enough, on total caloric load being lower, these ended up going higher. But here's where I want to make a special emphasis as to something that happened that people probably wouldn't have expected. After shifting from the low caloric to the high caloric, particularly for the first 2 to 3 days, I had more energy than I could stand. I had actually a difficult time sleeping on both the night of the 8th and the 9th. And it didn't start kind of taming down until a little bit later. you would think that I could really feel the difference between 5.4 at one end of the spectrum and 0.3 as far as ketosis goes. Or at a minimum, that I'd have more of my energy here, given everything that we read and understand about ketones. That was not the case. In fact, probably the only time that I started feeling a little more lag down was, I think, on the 13th, relative to what my normal state is. And this was the morning following my having been at 5,000 calories a day for 5 days. So I think I was just tired of eating by that point.
Yeah, figures of
and that's probably the thing that I really want to capitalize on right now, because I know that I stand apart from a lot of people in that I don't really care that much about my ketone measurements. Even though I take it every single day, and even though I am genuinely curious, I do find that it does counter against total blood glucose. But I also likewise know that my total blood glucose is higher over the course of being in this ketonic state, even though my insulin is lower, relatively speaking. So there's definitely glucose sparing that's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I finally gave up on, probably a good 9 or 10 months into the diet, was that I too tried to modulate down my protein. And in the course of trying to modulate down my protein, and I feel like Ted Naiman kind of addressed this pretty well, to accomplish that, you have to eat a lot less real food. You have to have more factory-based oils or other means that are very fat dense, but probably coming from a factory in some fashion. And the other factor was that my body just flat out craved more protein, especially in the form of meat. I just wanted to eat more meat. And so I started to just do that. I started having more, particularly meats, higher in saturated fat. And now I feel better than I ever have at any point on the diet. And the diet itself, I feel better than any time I've had before the diet.
Yeah, and this is something that happens with almost anyone who does a ketogenic diet. The moment they start ingesting adequate protein, they feel way better. But
Yes.
Here's another thing that I want to bring now that you show those numbers. If you go back and show this Excel spreadsheet with the amounts of protein and also the ketone readings that you had, we have lots of people like swearing about the ketone ratios, so the ketogenic diet ratios, the percentages. If you actually look at the amount of protein you were ingesting during the days of low calories and the amount of dietary fat you were ingesting, you are not near the suggested ketogenic ratios.
Yeah, actually, you know what? We can even look at that real quick.
Yeah, basically you were almost at half the protein of the ingested dietary fat. And then when you increased, you were at around 50, let's say 40 on average grams of protein per day and about 60 grams of fat. You are not near the usual ketogenic ratios.
You're speaking of trying to keep to 80% or higher?
Yeah, what normal people suggest, you know, because we have people that go and swear by the ketogenic ratios, the traditional therapeutic ketosis ratios, and they are afraid of going high on protein because, you know, they are just chasing ketone numbers and not worrying about the actual results they are achieving. So here, even though you went low on protein, you went also low on fat, and yet your ketone readings were like you were in ketosis. That is,
high ketosis. But I keep thinking about it from a system standpoint. I think that people keep treating this diet like it's a scorecard.
Yeah.
And not thinking about it as a system. Look, why would I think that your car's performance is going to have a lot to do with how much is in its gas tank?
I'm going to put another idea here. And who cares about how much ketones you have? I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, but the only persons who really care how much ketones you have in your system are the ones who are selling you ketones.
Well, yeah, certainly that's
putting it out there, and I don't have anything up against anybody. I actually use some products, some exogenous ketones for some special occasions, but look at who is pushing, being crazy about ketone readings. And what we say in Ketogains, and Amy Berger says as well, the same as Ted Neyman, you as well, is follow results, chase results, not a random ketone number. Who cares about who has the highest ketone reading?
Yes.
There's no use to following a high ketone reading unless you are needing high ketone readings for, to treat a certain illness, or because you actually need them, not because you are chasing weight loss or body recomposition.
Agreed. But I'll take it a step further. I wish more people could look at this like an engineer would look at it. When you do a blood draw, you're taking a snapshot of everything that is not in use in the blood. Let me repeat that for extra emphasis. Not in use, it's in travel, right? So the actual use by the mitochondria is not getting checked by a blood test. The bioavailability is relevant, and certainly knowing that that's accessible is good. But for example, you may have problems with the usage of oxaloacetate in order to get a lot of the energy into the mitochondria, right? And so you may actually have backup. You may have a point of overage with ketones that you're unaware of. But because you're chasing the score of having high ketones in the blood, you're comforted by that. I don't, for me, I'm going to the first and most important metric is how I feel.
Exactly.
I feel really great, but my numbers don't look like how the literature tells me or how other people tell me they're supposed to look. I'm going to always take a step back and go, does this make systemic sense? And most of the time I find what makes systemic sense is a lot of times things that gradually change over time, mechanistically. And in the case of energy expenditure and usage, mechanistically, it makes a lot of sense for my body to constantly be playing with and tweaking those numbers. And ketones in particular, going back to the original subject that we started this off with, is just one of the forms of energy, and really smaller version of the energy than the triglycerides that are in my system. So having very high ketones doesn't lead me to believe that I'm getting most of my energy from them, because I already know that that's not the case. I already know because I'm looking at the cholesterol tests that I'm doing from the next day, and they're a proxy for how many LDL particles are in play, which I can also see in my cholesterol score. And I know that those triglycerides are in use as well, because I'm getting so much of my energy from triglycerides.
Mm-hmm.
How much the ketones are in play, I think ultimately comes back more to brain energy management, proportionally speaking, than total cellular energy management. I know I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, but the point being is that getting obsessed about the score of how much ketones are in my blood to me seems ridiculous, frankly.
I agree completely. Okay, so I think we went through practically the groundbreaking part of your presentation, which is normally people would think that as you increase dietary cholesterol, numbers would increase, but you just proved that it actually happened inversely.
So let me actually summarize again what we're really talking about, because I know I'm kind of throwing out a lot of information here, but I myself don't put a lot of stock into the cholesterol test for the very reason that because I'm manipulating it so much, and I use the word manipulate intentionally, I'm able to manipulate it by total incoming food. And the total energy coming in seems to be counterbalanced by the total cholesterol that comes out of storage in those circulating low-density lipoproteins. So if you only care about your cholesterol score that shows up in a blood test, as I've advised many other people, and as I keep hearing anecdotal reports coming back, you can just gorge on enormous amounts of food, especially high in saturated fat.
But here's a parenthesis, is do it so without carbs.
Yes, exactly. Like you want to stay on a ketogenic ratio.
Yeah.
Assuming the blood test you're concerned about came from being on a ketogenic ratio.
Yes.
So in other words, your baseline is higher as far as what your starting total cholesterol is. However, I want to bring this back around to, I'm not sure how relevant any of this is, because I know that the vast majority of my energy is coming through the triglycerides contained in those low density lipoproteins. So I expect that there's going to be a higher trafficked amount. And I believe what determines the baseline is a lot more interesting to me. And that reminds me, actually, I did miss one last piece of information, which I was leading up to, which is what happened with the Ketogains conference with regard to the extra exercise that I've been getting and how that impacts my numbers. That'll obviously be very meaningful to keto gainers. And as you can see here, again, this is the truncated graph from over here. With this graph, you can see the brown line to the brown dot here, 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 and here. What the brown line represents is these are the times where I did distance running and had 7 to 10 miles or more. In fact, actually, a couple of these are after half marathons. That happened within the 3 days before the blood test. So I have a kind of data superpower, if you will, and that I know where my body would have likely had the blood test show up, because I now have such a tight understanding of where my baseline is. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, I know, carrying that over to this graph, that these numbers are lower than where they're expected to be. Therefore, it appears that having the distance running has actually given me lower cholesterol scores, not by a lot, but by a little. And this likewise shows up with LDLP. This also is a truncated graph of LDLP, same brown being where the gap is. As you can see, there's a gap between here and here for where it's expected to be. My suspicion is that actually the reason that there's less LDL particles and less LDL cholesterol in the bloodstream is because with enormous amounts of exercise, I am absolutely requiring more cellular repair.
Okay.
If there's more cellular repair, I'll bet there's more endocytosis. I'll bet that there actually is more engulfing of the existing LDLs that are in circulation. Don't know that for sure, and this is going to take more testing to do it. But I've been adamant all the way up until about the Ketogains seminar to not necessarily have a sedentary lifestyle, but to not get enormous amounts of exercise, because I knew that would be a confounding variable. And it appears as though I'm right about that. However, where this is going to get interesting is I've only done distance running. I've not done strength training or resistance training. And that's what I intend to change after the new year. I intend to run this experiment out. I have a few more marathons to run, which will complete in January. And then I'm going to have a span of time in which I don't do much exercise at all, see if it goes back to the expected baseline. And then I'm going to switch over to resistance training and actually see how much I can do and how much that'll also impact my cholesterol numbers. I'm very interested in what those numbers will look like.
I think it's going to be quite interesting because it's actually quite different, endurance training to resistance training.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I know a lot of people are going to be watching this and they're going to say, oh, good. My cholesterol will get lower if I do more exercise. So I need to be sure to do exercise so that my cholesterol gets lower. Again, that's not my perspective at all. I don't actually care that much about how high or low my cholesterol goes, because I'm not fully convinced of the atherogenic risk of lipoproteins, low-density lipoproteins, in the absence of things like oxidative stress and inflammation, which this diet helps on quite a bit.
So Dave, let's put it in in bullet points for people who want the whole takeaway of your research and the interview. First, let's say that you are not doing a ketogenic diet and you are worried about your cholesterol. You're going to be probably going to be put into statins by your doctor. So what would you say to someone who is in this context?
I can't render as strong an opinion on this, mainly because I'm coming from the perspective of knowing that a ketogenic diet has a lower inflammatory response. And I believe the inflammatory response is part of the issue. Now, that said, I know that the number needed to treat, and I'm going to go ahead and pull it up here because I do think anybody who's ever considering going on a statin really should know this. Okay. Over here we have what's known as the number needed to treat, as in how many people need to be treated before somebody is helped. This is an analysis from the NNT.com, which does this for lots of different medicines on statin drugs given for 5 years of heart disease prevention. A lot of people inside the industry already know this. But in summary, for those who take a statin for 5 years,
none were helped.
Yeah. But 1 in 104 were helped for preventing a heart attack. 1 in 154 were helped for preventing stroke. But there's also harms. 1 in 100 for developing diabetes. 1 in 10 suffer muscle damage.
Wow.
Now, I don't want to take too much more time to get into the mechanistic disconnect for me, but if a statin brought down your total and LDL cholesterol by as much as 30%, 50%, mechanistically, this alone ends up disputing for me the concentration claim of LDL particles. Because, and I used this analogy recently, if you were the mayor of Lewistown and you had 104 accidents every day, and I'm your city manager, and I say, oh, yeah, you know what, I know what'll fix this. Because there's 10,000 cars on the road every day, we need to drop it down to 5,000. And sure enough, I do, through some city planning, I managed to get the traffic down to 5,000 cars a day. And you go, so, okay, so now we don't have any traffic accidents, fatal traffic accidents that are killing so many people. Like, well, yeah, they've gone down. They went down from 104 to 103 after cutting that. You see what I'm saying? You don't actually have to be an engineer to know that there clearly is not a substantial causative factor to total LDL particle cholesterol. There's obviously something that's much more at play mechanistically, and I think it ultimately comes down to vascular damage.
Exactly.
So I don't care. I don't buy that my body is synthesizing that which it's going to poison itself with when I feel a greater sense of regulatory balance than I ever have in my life. I need to be convinced of that. And unfortunately, again, this is still a hypothesis. But I can tell you what is 100% causative. That same thing that I mentioned before, the chronic endothelial injury, that absolutely is proven almost every day in labs. Because in order to induce atherosclerosis, with a lab animal, they will go in with a balloon catheter and actually damage their endothelial layer on the carotid artery.
Mm-hmm.
And if you went to a lipidologist right now and you said, I'm going to give you $10 billion to prove to me that higher concentration of LDL particles are going to create atherosclerosis, they would go to the catheter. They would go, well, here's one way that I can absolutely guarantee that you're going to get atherosclerosis, and it's through endothelial damage. And it's at that moment in time that you got to say, okay, is there anything that links LDL particles to dealing with repair of endothelial damage? There is. Okay. Obviously, you need to care about the cause and effect association because you seem to be associating one where you should be associating the other. Endothelial damage, calling for help from LDL particles is the point where the world should have stopped and said, maybe LDL particles are the good guys who keep coming and trying to save the day.
Again, the ambulance analogy.
Exactly. And that brings me back to the ambulance analogy. It's silly to keep coming back and going, I just know ambulances are at fault here. I just got to find the evidence. And so eventually you just start coming up with theories like, well, maybe it's microorganisms that are inside the ambulance. That seems plausible. And therefore avoid all ambulances. To me, that just seems silly. So all I was going to say was on the good side, I can say this. My journey, I'm being completely transparent about. I'm taking no steps to lower my cholesterol. And in many ways, I could be Ansel Keys' best friend because I had no major metabolic derangements before I started. I'm not a smoker. I'm not a drinker. I'm a great specimen for not lowering his cholesterol and for yet building atherosclerosis from having higher LDL concentration.
Yeah, you should have had like 3 or 4 heart attacks by now.
And that's where I'm going with this is my calcium score was 0. My CIMT is normal. If in say 2 years, I have a calcium score of 200 and my CIMT is now all of a sudden building high amount of enema thickness, high amount of enema thickness. At that point, I'll state it plainly on my blog. I'll say, I was wrong. And
okay.
I'm happy to state that because this is a scientific journey, not one of opinion.
So to put it on point, would you say that what you would suggest to a person who has high cholesterol readings, who is very unhealthy and is about to be put on statins by his or her doctor, would be to actually first try a whole food approach with an emphasis on low carb, low inflammatory foods, and higher unsaturated fat. Basically a low carb or a ketogenic diet, instead of going all the way through statins and leaving everything as they normally suggest, which is a low fat diet.
It's ultimately going to come down to whether they can share the opinion I have. If you believe higher LDL cholesterol is going to increase your risk of dying, then you're not going to want any advice that I give, because where I'm coming from ultimately comes down to lowering oxidative stress and inflammation. And I don't really care that much where my cholesterol ends up.
Okay, and then this brings me to the next question I had for you. This is something that actually happened I was talking with my girlfriend who is a plastic surgeon. And she brought this idea to me that is, because I'm actually, I live, I have a little bit of community bias because I live and breathe on low carb community groups. But she is a little bit outside of the context. And she asked me, why in the world, if you know all this information and you have all these doctors and researchers who agree with you, why hasn't this theory been more known or more accepted in the whole medical community? Why is there such a disconnect? Why is such no real interest in all doctors and nutritionists to actually investigate this? And also, why do they take it as a truth when it's actually not working? Why no one has actually decided to make a real study or a more recent study that just like you are doing right now?
That part's actually easy. Coming from the technology world and managing teams of very competent people, there's no getting around the fact that there's enormous amounts of ego, even when you have enormous amounts of competence. So how many times do you talk to somebody who's very smart, they have a particular idea in their head, and sure enough, you caught one time where they were completely wrong. Mm-hmm. They have a tough time acknowledging that they're ever completely wrong. They prefer to, again, gets back to the rebranding. Well, I was mostly right, right? Maybe I was wrong about this one thing, etc. Right? Well, put that in the context of being a medical professional. Let's say that, this is why I'm careful about the way that I put it, but let's say that I told you, you need to reduce your saturated fat or you're going to die sooner. And you reduce your saturated fat, and by doing so, you bring up your carbs. And in doing so, you ultimately develop enormous amounts of hyperinsulinemia, eventually type 2 diabetes, full blown. And all this time you're following my advice as your doctor for 20 years, right? Now, this is where I genuinely feel some sympathy for them. If you find out that the advice you've been giving has been exactly the wrong advice, you're going to naturally have a response of cognitive dissonance. You're going to be more skeptical than ever, not just from the standpoint of it being new information, but also in how it can reflect on advice you've been giving to this point in time from an emotional standpoint. I mean, longevity is very emotional.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm going to be very upset at steps I may have taken that I thought were helping me, and in fact was hurting me, right? But by the same token, I feel like everybody should be more forgiving of doctors who are, like Tim Noakes is a great example, who've had it wrong for a long period of time. The evidence clearly makes it obvious that they need to change their ways and do so, and then proclaim it, wear it on their sleeves, right? That's hard to do. That's hard to do, particularly the higher up you are in the field.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this is not data driven. It really isn't. It's personality driven. It's the same thing in the legal profession. You want to think, when you're really young, you want to think laws are very ironclad and people are going to fall in line to enforce them the correct way. And then as you get older, you go, no, actually it kind of depends on what government's running, depends on what judge you draw. No, not your public defender is not as good as that pricey $1,000 an hour lawyer that you could be getting. All of these things are also true in medicine. And unfortunately, in the case of cholesterol in particular, there's a lot more entrenchment because the statin industry is the largest, most profitable medical industry that has ever existed in human history. Nothing comes anywhere close to cholesterol-lowering drugs. When you think about it, I would say that it's actually kind of a tragedy that I, as an engineer, am bringing this information to the public, because we've had several decades of the field of lipidology, and we've had NMRs, we've had centrifuges going back several decades as well. I'm doing this test privately with my own money, and I'm able to come up with these graphs, and I've yet to speak to a single lipidologist in the conventional field.
Yeah, but then why? Like, why is not any cardiologist or, okay, let me rephrase it, because I'm sure there are a few out there that are actually, taking steps in their, or taking matters in their own hands, but why is there such a cognitive dissonance between actual cardiologists? Here in Mexico, I haven't not met a single one that actually is in line with what we just talked about here.
Because it represents risk. The problem is that we do have enormous amounts of entrenchment. I'm not as familiar with Mexico in particular, but I know in the US, the fact that you had these bureaus like the American Heart Association that put out guidelines, those guidelines end up becoming the very thing that is a weapon against the advancement of the science. Take, for example, what happened recently with, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but in Australia, the doctor that was silenced.
Oh, yeah.
So, yes. He was silenced by a board with virtually no due process of any kind. He couldn't face his accusers. He couldn't call witnesses. He couldn't even just present evidence. He couldn't just say, look, here's the evidence as it stands, right? Mm-hmm. And I believe that was not just as much to silence him. I believe it was also to, a further note to all other Australian doctors to make an example of him.
Yeah.
Because certainly past this point, more of the Australian doctors who might have been advising low carb are going to back off of it. They're not backing off of it because there's some new evidence that came to light that shows that lower carb is more dangerous. They're backing off of it because they just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars getting this career. And now all of a sudden they've got to make some different choices. Recently, there's the news that came out of London that there's an enormous amount of disconnect between doctors who are actually practicing low carb versus not advising it. But they're not advising it because they don't want to incur any liability. And again, makes sense if that's the career you're into. There's an enormous amount of risk in trying to advise patients or even experiment, because they can always come back and sue you, or somebody can make a complaint and come after you as well.
Well, it's quite sad in a way, but I am also glad that we live in this day and age that persons like you and me can make our own research. Yep. and get things out done out there without actually being compromised.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm glad that there are now more people. I'll have more on this on my blog pretty soon. There are more N of ones that are doing variations of my experiment that I'm also going to happily be able to report to see if this pattern holds. At some point, I'm going to be able to get a study together that my dream would be that it would be at least 12 to 20 people with controls and experiment group. And can't really pull off double blind because you know what you're actually eating. But that said, even just be able to see if we can observe these same patterns in not just ketogenic, but it would be stunning if it turned out to also be in carb adapted. Because if you're carb centric and these patterns existed as well, then that would be one of the biggest failings of the medical industry, that this had been missed for this long a period of time.
Yeah. As you said, it would be quite a blow to the industry as well as to the establishment.
Yeah, and again, I understand why personalities and liability have driven people in this direction for such a period of time. But to your point, yeah, it takes kind of a tenacity to want to really find this out, to get the research together, to move it to the next step. And honestly, I have to say that it's the people who've reached out to me that have become such a motivating factor. I've had a lot of people who said that I've had a few people that were very emotionally proclaiming that they had accidentally fasted, not accidentally, they were intentionally trying to fast up to their cholesterol test in the hopes that it would lower from what its last test result was. And since doing that, and then since taking on my protocol and blowing up the total amount of fat they had, they lowered their cholesterol score and got their doctor off their back for trying to prescribe a statin. That stuff like really kind of touches me, because these are people making lifelong decisions on a single annual cholesterol test, assuming that it hardly moves. That's glacial, because that's also what their doctors are telling them. And I'm sorry, I feel like that's a travesty. That's a worldwide travesty. So I'm really not going to sleep quite as well until this thing has enough inertia on its own. And at a minimum, even if you don't agree with the low carb lifestyle, even if you may or may not agree with the general theory, that at a minimum, you understand that the lipid system is far more dynamic than is currently believed, and that so much more is relevant in just the days before you take the test. That I would hope everybody could take away.
As an engineer, you just gave away a secret hack for hacking your blood test as well as your probably insurance test.
Yep, I've had two people that have written on the insurance. It might be three, but I know for sure that two of the people have written in, and one guy wrote me like a 3-page email that just kind of went into all sorts of financial things he's done, but that this ended up being his favorite one because it was the easiest for him to do. He had taken the test for like a week and a half before he found my blog, and then it was just 4 days later he took the test again, and then immediately excitedly wrote this huge email back to me talking about how awesome that was. So I got a good kick out of that.
You know what? I may as well probably in the next month or starting in December, I'm going to replicate your test.
I would love that. I would love every major low carb personality. If I could, I would pay them if I had the money. I would say, just do this, because the more people who actually do this and report it back, the better. But you got to go. You got to do the test before and the test after, and absolutely gun it. Go crazy and eat enormous amounts of fat, and then show what the test shows afterwards. And the more people that do it, the harder it is to ignore.
Yeah, count me in. I'm pretty sure Tyler will follow as well, and many more of our people on Ketogains. So
that would be awesome.
So Dave, again, thanks a lot for giving this practically almost 2 hours interview. It's incredibly groundbreaking. I am sure it's going to break a lot of ideas that people have set in stone. So Dave, where can people find you and read about you or follow your experiments?
Well, of course, there's my blog at cholesterolcode.com. I'll actually be starting a new blog coming into the new year but it's more specific to me. And they can follow me on Twitter at Dave Keto, DaveKeto. And of course, there's Facebook. I obviously hang out at the Ketogains Facebook group from time to time. You guys always post a lot of great content there.
Dave, thanks so much for sharing your experiment with us and doing all the research you'll be doing. We'll be in touch in the Ketogains forum.
Thanks so much for having me.